Okay, I think we're all set. Welcome back, everybody, to Contemporary Economic Policy Issues. Today, we'll be talking about the history of discrimination in U.S. economic policy. It's kind of it provides a lot of important background for the talk that we'll have next week on the black-white wealth gap. Here is, again, a slide that I put up before every talk. Encouraging people to reach out to me if you're interested in having a speaker come to whatever other group you're a member of that brings in speakers, Rotary, Kiwani, retirement community, what have you. Our talks are free unless your organization has some deep pockets, and then we do encourage a tax-deductible donation. And these are the most popular of the talks that we give. All right, so as I mentioned, we've got discriminatory policies in U.S. history, and then next week, the black-white wealth gap. So unless there are any sort of general questions about the class, I'm going to go ahead and get started. In terms of questions, I think let's have you submit them in the chat, and I'll keep my eye on the chat window and try to address them as they come up. But there should be plenty of time at the end of my talk for questions. So
Jon,
please.
let me just say that I think we would like to make a donation. This class has been really good. Didn't realize you were interested in donations, and so we'll do that.
Oh, well, that would be terrific. I very much appreciate that. Thanks.
Okay.
NEED is a nonprofit, and it's funded largely by me. So anybody who would like to make a donation, I'd like to encourage that. Thanks. Okay, so let's get on with government policies with racial implications. This was a slide deck was put together by myself and Derek Hamilton at the New School. It is still a little bit of a work in progress, so it hasn't been reviewed by anybody yet. Being the executive director of the organization, I can make the decision as to whether or not it goes out in public. I've given it a few times, so this isn't exactly a trial run for it, but we will talk about the history of policies, policies that were discriminatory, some explicitly and some not. And then we'll talk a little bit about anti-discrimination policies, both during the civil rights movement, and we'll talk a little bit about affirmative action. And then I'll provide some data on economic consequences that likely stem from this history of policies. All right, so race in policy. There are, as I mentioned, there are policies that were explicitly discriminatory, slavery, of course, being one of them, redlining, another one. And then there are lots and lots of policies out there with discriminatory effect, right? Perhaps highway location. Down in Los Angeles, there was an article in the LA Times not long ago about a Black family that was going to be displaced a second time. From the development of, I don't remember which highway it was. I think it was probably the 405, but when it was put in, initially, the family had to move, and now that it's being widened, family had to move again. And these highways generally go through low income and minority neighborhoods. Because, of course, the high income white neighborhoods would rather they not go through their neighborhoods, right? So, often discrimination is written in covertly. It is the law ends up being written in a way that is intended to allow for discrimination, but not exactly explicitly. And then, as I mentioned, the anti-discrimination policies, Civil Rights Act, and affirmative action. Okay, first I want to put up a slide that sort of, just gives you a little bit of a picture of where we're going. Talk about the slave trade just a little bit. In terms of the black-white wealth gap next week, I think of the slave trade as being largely the first deprivation of wealth, right? What we did was we went over to Africa and we grabbed people out of their natural environment, and they likely had a store of wealth. What form that wealth takes, I don't know. It might be community, it might be property, it might be goods, don't know, but whatever it was, they were deprived of it. And then slavery, of course, deprived Africans brought to the United States of the opportunity to generate wealth, of the opportunity to do much of anything. 40 acres and a mule. We'll talk about how this policy was reversed. Well, if I think back to my high school education, I remember learning about 40 acres and a mule, but I do not remember learning that it was reversed. This is, I like to think of this as the second great deprivation of Black Americans from being deprived of wealth and the opportunity to develop it, and the discriminatory distribution of land. Freedmen's Bank will talk a little bit about this. It was great until, worked great until there were large sums of money in there, and then white bankers got a hold of it and put most of the money at risk. Jim Crow laws in the wake of Reconstruction, the Homestead Act, and one of those laws that's not overtly discriminatory, but in effect turned out to have been land theft and destruction. Right, there are lots of instances of white Americans going in and just burning down Black neighborhoods. The most prominent is probably the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We just commemorated the 100th anniversary of that a couple of years ago. And the GI Bill, well, I had long thought of the GI Bill as being this great thing, this engine of real economic growth for the United States. And it turns out it was, but it was a real engine of economic growth for white people. There were housing elements, education elements, unemployment elements, and most of them went in favor of white people. And although Black GIs were eligible, they got less in the way of benefits than white did. And then the Federal Housing Authority and redlining. We'll talk in some detail about redlining. And there are so many more that I don't really want to go through all of them. Okay, so first let's have a look at some policies with discriminatory intent. Right, I mentioned slave trade and slavery. Reconstruction was roughly the 10 to 12 year period following the Civil War. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We'll talk about Black codes that came up during Reconstruction and vagrancy laws, Jim Crow and federal housing policy, and how all of these things served to really subjugate freed slaves when slavery was abolished. Well, let's go back and let's talk a little bit about the slave trade, some numbers on the slave trade. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the 1619 Project from the New York Times. And 1619 is a relevant date only because it really marked the arrival of African slaves directly on North American shores, directly in the colonies. It was in 1619 the first slaves came off the boat in Jamestown, Virginia. Right, there had been slavery for a long time prior to this date, and most of the slaves went to some place in the Caribbean, to Haiti, to Cuba, where the voyage was devastating to most of them, and they were nursed back to some health in the Caribbean, and then brought up to the colonies for ultimate sale. But it is likely that slavery in North America began with Christopher Columbus in the 1490s. Now, there's probably, I believe that there is a literature that establishes slavery between Indian tribes in the United States long before that, but the slavery that we're discussing really probably started with Christopher Columbus. So the slave trade, largely took place between 1525 and 1808. During that time, about 12.5 million slaves were brought to the New World. Only 10.7 million of them survived the Middle Passage, and only about 388,000 arrived directly on American shores in the colonies. As I mentioned, vast majority went someplace in the Caribbean. Right. In 1808, the importation of slaves was banned in the United States. And when I first learned this, I was kind of surprised. Well, why? How did that make it through all of the Southern politicians who were, the South was thriving through slavery? But then I turned on my economist's hat and recognized that, well, by 1808, the Southern slave owners, largely had their slaves. And they kind of viewed the importation of more slaves as increasing competition. Right? So if you cut off the importation of slaves, then you reduce the supply of slaves below what it could be, and that raises the value of slaves. Right? So everybody who owned a slave ganged up with everybody who didn't think that slavery should happen, and they managed to ban the importation of slaves in 1808. Right? And this, right, as I mentioned, the slave trade, a significant deprivation of wealth for Africans. Moving on to slavery, right, there were the slave codes. Slaves were legally considered to be property, and their offspring were also considered to be property. not allowed to assemble without the presence of a white person. This is for obvious reasons, right? If they assemble, they can plan mass escape and difficulties for the white slave owners. Slaves that lived off the plantation had a curfew. A slave accused of any crime against a white person was doomed. There was very little that would prevent capital punishment from being carried out on a slave that was guilty of not a severe infraction. It was illegal to teach a slave to read, and slave marriages were not acknowledged in law, right? And that goes back to the first principle of there being property, right? And there's, even if they were married, there was no need for the slave owners to acknowledge the marriage. They could separate them. They could continue to do what they would. Right, so this had implications for the period of Reconstruction and economic independence, but we'll get to that in a little bit. First, I want to talk about why slavery. Right, there were other options. They could have gone to indentured servitude, right? And on its face, that might look like a better option, because indentured servants, you could pick and choose and find some that had skills and talents that might have been relevant. Well, the answer is largely opportunity and familiarity, right? So slavery had been practiced by Europeans for 1,000 years by the time it came to the colonies. Slavery was pretty standard practice in European colonies. Disease and extermination often necessitated the importation of African slaves. And I'm sure we're all aware of the impact of disease on Native Americans long before, as a result of the arrival of the Europeans. Right, and cotton was a major crop in the antebellum South. Right, and it's very labor intensive, and it's cheaper than paying free labor. Cheaper than indentured servitude. And just a little economics on the difference in costs. Right, so why slavery? It could be used. You could have used free indentured servitude. Slavery it won the price productivity competition. Right, so if you hired a free or an indentured servant, you'd have to pay 10 to 12 pounds. For about 4 years worth of service. That's £3 per year. Slaves, you had to pay about 16 pounds for a slave, but that slave was yours for 20 years. And if that slave ended up having children, well, so much the better. So slaves ended up costing a little bit less than £1 per year. Right, and it turns out that despite the possibility of hiring indentured servants with skills, turned out that slaves were higher productivity than their free counterparts would have been. Slaves were driven and heavily incentivized to be extremely productive. There's this whole literature in economic history that talks about the productivity of slaves and how there's one arm of it that says that the slave owners were extremely entrepreneurial and look at the productivity improvements that happened over time. But there's another strand of the literature that talks about how the slave owners weren't particularly entrepreneurial or clever, but they knew how to wield a whip. And so they would continuously drive the slaves to higher and higher productivity. Right, today you did 4 bushels. Well, okay, then tomorrow you have to do 5, and if you don't do 5 tomorrow, well, meet the whip. And if you did 5, well, okay, then the next day it's 6. Right, so the slaves were the real entrepreneurial ones who figured out how to avoid the whip. Another important aspect of slavery is that as opposed to free labor, the cotton is very seasonal. And if you have slaves, then they're available to you all the time. You don't have to worry about finding workers when it comes time to pick the cotton. Right, a little bit more economics on slavery. Right, in 1860, slavery was very, very profitable for those who engaged in it, those who owned slaves. Right, there were more millionaires in the Mississippi River Valley than anywhere else in the United States, and all of them were slaveholders. And in 1816, there were about 4 million slaves, worth about $3.5 billion at the time, making them the single largest financial asset. The value of the slaves was worth more than all of manufacturing and the railroads in the U.S. And the value of the slaves was about equal to U.S. GDP at the time. right? So slaves were, a very, very important part of the U.S. economy. And they were a very important part of just the populations of many southern states. Alabama, 45% of its population was slave. Louisiana was 47%, Mississippi 55%, North Carolina 57%. Overall in the South, slaves made up about a third of the entire population. All right, so I talked a little bit about the value of slaves, and their value changed significantly over time. This graph goes from roughly 1808, when the importation of slaves was eliminated, and you can see that in the years following that, the value of the stock of slaves in the United States continued to increase, and that accelerated in the 1840s. With the increasing export of cotton. Right, so over here on the right, the lower line, that's the value of cotton exports. You can see in the 1940s, the value of cotton exports ticked up very significantly. The value of exports did, and that indicates an increase in demand for cotton, indicates an increase in price for cotton, and so that increased the value of the slaves. Now, throughout this period, 1810 to 1840, a lot of this increase in the value of the slaves was an increase in the number of slaves, largely because of slaves that were born into slavery. All right, how much did slavery contribute to Southern income? So this again is 1860. If we look at Alabama, about 45% of the population were slaves. The per capita or per person earnings of free whites in 1860, about $120. The slave earnings per free white was about $50. So the fraction of earnings in the Alabama economy was about 2/5, right? Nearly half of the earnings in the economy. Right, so the entire U.S. economy really benefited from cheap cotton. Those in the North, right, we like to think of the North as being adamantly anti-slave, and those in the South as being adamantly pro-slave. Well, that's not necessarily the case. A lot of Northern merchants were making out like bandits, right? The cotton wasn't put on boats in the South and shipped over to Europe. And cotton was shipped up to New York, where manufacturing enterprises would turn it into something of greater value, at which point it would be shipped off to Europe and other destinations. David asks, was cotton 40% of all U.S. exports in the 1800s? So if we go back to this graph, it looks like at times it was as much as 40%, right? So here it's about 190 to 350. Yeah, that's a little bit more than 40%. So it was a really significant part of U.S. exports. Okay, great. So important contributions to income, not only in the South, but in the North. Part of why that was going to be difficult to abolish it by political means, right? So we had the Civil War. Following the Civil War, we had amendments that were quickly put into place to maintain the outcome of the Civil War, if you will. So there was the 13th Amendment in 1865. And the role of this amendment was largely to abolish slavery. I'll talk in a minute about why it didn't fully, well, I'll talk about it now. Right? It didn't fully abolish slavery because somebody convicted of a crime could still, under the 13th Amendment, be sold into slavery, mostly to pay off their debts, but it's clear that rarely happened. And we'll talk more about that. The 14th Amendment, this is important for granting citizenship to a large number of the slaves, giving them status. And it's currently, this is why the United States is relatively unique in the developed world as having citizenship for those born on the territory of the country. And that's a part of the immigration debate that we have. And that's a story for another day. The 15th Amendment sought to eliminate discrimination in voting. As I'm sure many of you are aware, right, there were lots of efforts. There were poll taxes. There were a wide variety. Poll taxes, literacy tests, wide variety of impediments to voting despite the 15th Amendment. Okay, so let's go back to the days following the end of the Civil War. The federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. This was a bureau intended to provide services and aid and to help former slaves get a start. It offered lots of food and medical services to former slaves, established schools. In 1870, about 250,000 freed slaves attended more than 4,000 schools in the South. It tried to establish labor rights for freed slaves, fair wages and free choice of employers, but as we'll see, that largely went away in the wake of Reconstruction. Right. So it did during Reconstruction, free public education was made available in the South. That sort of dissipated over time after 1877. We'll talk about 40 acres. We'll talk about black codes. And Reconstruction largely ended in 1877 when the Northern soldiers had all left. Right. So there was no enforcement mechanism, and there's no mechanism to push for broader or better rights for the freed slaves. All right, so what about 40 acres and a mule? I probably spend too much time on this because I was so surprised that the land was given back. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. It has its origins in January of 1865. A bunch of black leaders went to General Sherman and said, hey, we got all these freed slaves. We got to find a way to give at least some of them a head start, give them something on which to build their economic futures. Right. And General Sherman agreed, and they came up with the idea of giving plots of land that were formerly owned by slaveholders, former plantation land, give each of them 40 acres to do with what they would. So for a while, about 400,000 acres was given from Confederate landowners to the former slaves. Also, as part of this, they established some black settlements to be governed entirely by black people themselves. And my understanding is that most of those black settlements are still currently largely black areas right now. So where the mule comes from, 40 acres and a mule, the mule comes from the fact that later Sherman noticed that the Army had a lot of spare mules, right? They were really useful during the war. The war is over. What to do with the mules? And they thought, well, let's let the freed slaves on their 40 acres use the mules. Very, very helpful in terms of developing the land and generating economic gain out of the land. Right. Well, 40 acres lasted for a short while. It was overturned by Andrew Johnson in the fall of 1865. And I'm sure that, I don't remember when John Wilkes Booth died, but if he was aware of this, I'm sure that he was very proud of himself, right? Because that would not have happened had Abraham Lincoln not been shot. Right. Andrew Johnson was very much pro-slavery. And what Andrew Johnson did was not only return the land to the former slave owners, but reparations were offered to the former slave owners for the slaves that they lost as a result of the Civil War. Right. And you can imagine, right, the implications. 400,000 acres in the South were turned over to blacks, only to be taken away. Right. And the value of that land, the value of all the proceeds from having worked the land, by some estimates, that could be worth about $6.4 trillion in today's money. That's going to go some way towards closing the black-white wealth gap that we'll talk about next week, but not nearly close at all. Right. So 40 acres, I find that whole thing to be very interesting. And then there are the black codes. Right. Special laws that were applied only to black persons, the freed slaves. These black codes were both progressive and restrictive. It allowed black ownership of property, and it allowed marriage, allowed the right to sue and to be sued. But they also included labor contracts, right? When you got a job as a freed slave, you signed a contract to work for a year. Right, so you were really, tied to that job for a period of a year. As we'll talk about in a minute, that had implications for things like the Homestead Act. Right, black freed slaves that were in a contract for a year, they couldn't jump right up and head out west. It established apprenticeships and vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws very, very important, as we'll talk about in a minute. There were lots of inequities built into these black codes. For instance, the black licensing fee. If you look over on the right-hand side of the slide, there was a business licensing fee for black entrepreneurs of $100, and the same fee for white entrepreneurs was $0. Right, and $100 back in the day in 1870, that's quite a bit, right? So that was an enormous impediment to freed slaves starting up small businesses. And you could imagine how the implications of that would spiral over time. It's often thought in today that entrepreneurship and starting your own business is the path to greater wealth and fortune than simply going out and getting a job. Well, we deprived freed slaves from that opportunity. There were separate black courts under the black codes, right? There were harsh penalties for rebellion, arson, burglary, and especially for assaulting a white woman, right? And these black codes, yes, progressive and restrictive, but really largely concerned with controlling the former slaves. Right, in 1877, the black codes turned into the Jim Crow laws. Right, these were sets of laws that imposed restrictions on Black Americans and on voting, education, work, public office, juries, justice system, and introduced segregation. Right, segregated use of both private and public facilities. Basically, a set of customs defined how Black and white individuals would interact. And Jim Crow really lasted through the 1960s. It really lasted through the Civil Rights era. Barry asks, black codes were state laws, varied from state to state. Barry, I believe that they were state laws, and there was some variation, but they were pretty consistent with each other across the southern states. Right. Okay, so the Jim Crow era also exploited a loophole in the 13th Amendment that I mentioned. It allowed for the provision, it had a provision that allowed for slavery as punishment for a crime. So sort of debt peonage, very often what happened, in combination with the vagrancy laws that were put in place with the black codes, is that, in the middle of the daytime, if there was a Black woman or child walking down the street, they would be arrested and accused of vagrancy. And there would be a fee for being arrested. There would be a fee for the trial. There would be a fee for a lawyer. There would be fees that were racked up. And then some very generous white man would come in and pay the fee and take the Black individual to their essentially slave farm and put them to work. Work them very, very hard, ostensibly to pay off the fees that were paid. But then more often than not, the white individual would charge more fees, right? Would charge for room and board, would charge for food, would charge for clothing. And so it actually put the formerly freed slaves in a position that was worse than slavery. It was worse than slavery because now where you were enslaved, you weren't owned. Right, so you weren't an asset to the slaveholder. You weren't an asset to the white man, and so if you were going to be there for 2 years, the white man didn't care if you died a day after you were released. And so the conditions in these work camps were much, much worse than they were for the enslaved individuals. Right. So is this the second slavery? There's a gap in the 13th Amendment. About 200,000 Black Americans were forced into such labor arrangements, as I just mentioned. So this was a huge part of controlling Black freed slaves, right? Because, there was only 200,000 that were forced into those labor arrangements, but all of the rest of them lived in fear of being arrested and being forced into such a labor arrangement, right? That means that their activities were very restricted. And this lynching turned into the prison chain gangs of the early 20th century. Lynching, another way of controlling Black Americans. There were more than 4,400 lynchings that occurred during the Jim Crow years, and land takings, right? It's estimated that during the Jim Crow years, about 11 million acres were taken from Black Americans through fraud, deception, and just outright theft. And not all of that theft was in the South. there are documented cases of land theft in Peoria, Illinois, and throughout the North as well. So we can't really draw this line, the South being, pro-slavery, the North being anti-slavery. It's just not right. Much more of a mixed bag in the North. Right. So, and that brings us to, the New Deal, which was put in place sort of contemporaneously with the Jim Crow laws. There were some parts of the New Deal that were explicitly discriminatory. I've mentioned the FHA policy of redlining a couple of times. We'll talk more about that. Social Security, implicitly discriminatory, unemployment and minimum wages, all three of those things implicitly discriminatory for the same reason, right? Basically, some occupations were excluded from Social Security, unemployment, and minimum wages, and those turned out to be occupations that were heavily occupied by Black Americans. All right, let's talk first about more about FHA discrimination. Right, between 1934 and 1962, about $120 billion worth of home loans was backed by the federal government. The federal government backed about 3 out of every 5 home loans between 1930 and 1959. More than 98% of these loans went to white families. Of the 350,000 new homes built in Northern California between 46 and 60, less than 100 of them went to Black Americans. Right, so even here in liberal California, this policy was very discriminatory. Right, and it was discriminatory, and Black individuals, loans for Black individuals buying in white neighborhoods were not backed by the federal government, because the federal government maintained the position that if that happened, Black individuals moving into white neighborhoods, then that would reduce the property values of the other properties in the white neighborhoods. And since the federal government was backing those loans, if those property values declined, then that will put their loans at risk, right? And they didn't want that. There's been some research on this by economists, and generally what they believe happened was not so much that the fact of a Black family moving into a white neighborhood reduced home values, but it was really the rhetoric of the federal government that caused a Black family moving into a white neighborhood to lower property values, right? The government essentially convinced homeowners and home buyers that if there were Black individuals and families living in a neighborhood, that home values would be lower, right? So it was really the rhetoric of the government that led to the fact of a Black family moving into a white neighborhood, lowering all of the property values. Now, so if the federal government had just stayed out of it, not made any mention of it, and backed loans in a non-discriminatory basis, there would have been much more integration of so many neighborhoods throughout the United States that would have changed our landscape to today. Okay, so beyond that, there was the system of redlining. Right, I'm sure most of us have heard about redlining, but the details of it were essentially that the federal government delineated different areas in a given city. Right, there are grade A, grade B, grade C, and grade D areas. You can imagine grade A is the best, grade D is the worst, and grade A areas, these are areas that are growing rapidly. They're up-and-coming neighborhoods where professional men lived, and they were largely homogeneous, right? Lacking, and I quote this because this is the language of the law establishing the language of the manual grading guide. They lacked a single foreigner or Negro, right? So they were expressly white neighborhoods and growing white neighborhoods. Grade B, these are neighborhoods that had maybe already been established. They'd reached their peak. They thought they were stable and low risk of infiltration by non-white groups. Grade C, large threat of infiltration by foreign-born Negro or lower grade populations. And grade D, these are red areas. These are red areas where infiltration already occurred. Maybe they were largely Black neighborhoods, right? So this is where the redlining term came. Basically, it's the line around red neighborhoods is the red line that people are talking about. And here is San Francisco. I forget what year this is from. Maybe somebody can read it on there. I'm not sure that I can. This was the map that was drawn for the city of San Francisco. And you can see, neighborhoods here. We've got this neighborhood is blue and green. Down here, we've got blue and green. Over here in Hunters Point, we've got lots of red and yellow. You can see how the federal government divvied up San Francisco. And you kind of get a sense, if you know San Francisco very well, you kind of get a sense that, well, this redlining probably had a dramatic impact on not only the neighborhoods back in the day, but on the neighborhoods to today. Right. So in San Francisco, the red areas were largely Black communities, considered too risky to give a home loan. The yellow areas also suffered from discrimination resulting from the FHA guidelines, right? So there were implications. We talk about redlining, but there were implications for other neighborhoods as well, right? There's clearly an impact on not only the D areas, but also the C areas. In the C and D areas, we saw more residential segregation, lower home ownership rates. Why lower home ownership rates? Not only because the population in those neighborhoods was low income, but because since they had been graded as C or D, the possibility of home appreciation was much lower in C and D, so much less worthwhile to buy your home. And consequently, lower home values in C and D, lower demand for the homes, lower property values, and lower home values. Lower rents and credit scores in most of these neighborhoods as well. Right. So, because of legislation in the 60s and 70s, the trends in most of these neighborhoods were reversed. Home ownership rates started to increase, home values started to increase, segregation started to decline. But it's really true that if you superimpose the 1930s designations as A, B, C, or D, you can see today, you can see differences in the neighborhoods, right? So today, 74% of the neighborhoods that were graded as hazardous 80 years ago are low to moderate income today. 64% of the grade D areas continue to be racial and ethnic minority neighborhoods, and 91% of the areas deemed best or grade A in the 1930s remain upper to middle income today, right? 85% are still predominantly white, right? And I really I like this quote, and it's very apropos of our conversation next week from the University of Richmond, as homeownership was arguably the most significant means of intergenerational wealth building in the United States in the 20th century. These redlining practices from 8 decades ago had long-term effects in creating wealth inequalities that we still see today. Right, so you'll see towards the end of this talk and next week more on those wealth inequalities that exist, in particular between Black and white households. Okay, so if we fast forward a little bit to after World War II, right? After World War II, it turns out that residential covenants and discriminatory zoning, I apologize, were being put in place. Single family versus multifamily zoning was an effort to segregate housing. Right? Anybody know where this type of zoning got its origin? If you don't know, you will never ever guess. If anybody knows, put it in the chat. All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so I'm guessing that nobody knows that it started in our very own Berkeley, California. Liberal hotspot Berkeley, it turns out, was the first city in the United States to zone as single family versus multifamily zoning, right? And they did it for obvious reasons. Single family homes, much more expensive than multifamily homes. So it was an effort at not only racial segregation, but income segregation as well. Okay, so a little bit of California history there. The GI Bill that has been classified as affirmative action for whites, and we'll talk in some detail about why exactly that is. It's especially in terms of housing. But in terms of housing, there's also been discrimination, right? At every part of the home buying process, there was discrimination, right? From appraisals to realtors to mortgage receipt and the terms of the mortgage. I don't know if any of you have become aware of this, but There was a black family. I live in Marin in San Rafael, and in Marin City, there's a little bit to the south of me. There was a black family, I think it's just a black couple, who went to sell their home maybe 4 or 5 years ago. They went to sell their home, and so they did the first thing that everybody does these days when they want to put their home on the market. And they went to Zillow and said, "Hey, Zillow, how much is my home worth?" Right? Zillow is not always spot on, but it gives you a pretty good idea of your starting point. And Zillow told them that your home was worth about $1.5 million. They said, "Okay, great." And so they called in an appraiser. They called in an appraiser, and that appraiser valued the home at $1 million, about $500,000 less than Zillow did. And they're pretty savvy individuals, so they thought, well, that's not right. And they tried to figure out what might be going wrong. And what occurred to them, of course, is that they're a black family living in Marin. And so what they did was they whitewashed their house. Right? They took out any evidence that a black couple lived there. They called a new appraiser, and when the appraiser arrived, they were greeted at the door by a white friend of the black couple. So as far as the appraiser knew, it was a white family selling the house. And lo and behold, the appraisal came in at $1.5 million. Right now, there's no guarantee that $500,000 went away because of racism, but they did end up suing, and the case was settled not long ago. And there have been studies in the interim that have indicated that, yeah, there is a lot of racism in the appraisal market. And if you just sort of step back from it, you can think about the implications of that for white and black wealth generation, right? If your home is worth $1.5 million, and it only appraises for $1 million, then there's no bank that's going to write a mortgage to anybody based on a $1.5 million mortgage price. So the amount that you're going to be able to sell the house for is dramatically reduced, right? So if the black couple then goes and sells their house for $1 million, they just lost $500,000 in wealth. And they probably sell it to a white family who then just gained $500,000 in wealth. Right? So you can see low appraisals as being a transfer of wealth from black families to white families, even as we talk today. David says, "The covenant for my property explicitly bans sale to a non-white. This was made non-enforceable decades ago, but the covenant was still handed me when I bought it a decade ago." Yeah, David, I think that's ubiquitous throughout California. I sort of passively am aware of efforts to eliminate all of those covenants, but yes, they're decidedly unenforceable today. Right, so housing in the post-World War II era, difficult for black versus white individuals, even leading up to today. Okay, so let's talk about policies with discriminatory effect. What I first want to do is give an example of how a policy can be discriminatory without intentionally being discriminatory, right? So here's an example. Let's suppose that a town decides to give every child with a library card a free book. Okay, that makes sense. You want to hand out books to the kids that are most likely to read them. If a kid's got a library card, that means that they're one of the kids that's most likely to read it. Right? You want to target where your free books go. All right. Well, how can it go wrong? It can go wrong because suppose that white children have access to a library and black children do not, right? Possibly because, well, it's probably the wealthier white individuals in the city or the town who help determine where the library is going to be located. And they're likely to be wealthier and whiter. And so the library is more likely to be put in a wealthy white neighborhood. And so the white kids have better access to the library than the black kids do. Right? So perhaps because the parents have the time and the resources to advocate for one. More white children will have library cards, more white children will get books, black children are less likely to get books. Oops. And therefore it's discriminatory in its effect. Right? Nobody set out to discriminate with the policy, but the outcome of the policy, because of discrimination in other aspects of society, this policy ends up being discriminatory, right? Policies for cities, are made on a discriminatory basis. The personal anecdote that I like to share at this point in this talk is that 3 or 4 years ago, I was thinking of running for a school board. And so I started attending school board meetings on a regular basis. And I will, I think, never ever forget one particularly awkward school board meeting. San Rafael is a pretty segregated city. There's the Latino community over in the canal, and then the rest of the city is largely white, largely moderate high to high income. And at this school board meeting, so there was an elementary school in the Latino neighborhood. There was a teacher from that school who stood up and was begging for air conditioning. Right, as things get hotter and hotter, it's hard to learn when it's hot in a classroom. And she talked about how she appreciates the efforts that had been tried over decades. A few years back, they had tried industrial fans, great big industrial fans that move a lot of air and are very noisy. And she said, well, that was a good try, but you can't teach over an industrial fan. And so she was begging the school board to allocate money to put air conditioning in the school. Well, the very next person, and I don't know to this day if it was staged, it might have been, but the very next person was a white, clearly well-to-do father who stood up and said, well, this is slightly awkward, but I'm here to thank you for the air conditioning that you put in TL High School, right? TL High School being a largely white high school, right? So just in a 10-minute span, introduced to how decisions can be made on a discriminatory basis, right? Largely because it's white families that have the time and the resources to advocate for what they want. It's not the lower income families. And so it's the white kids in the education system that get more of what they need. Okay, so that's an example. The Homestead Act also turns out to be a pretty good example. Between 1868 and 1934, 246 million acres of Western land, about the size of California and Texas combined, was given away. All right, you could apply for 160 acres of land, meant you had to file for an application, or file an application. You had to improve the land for 5 years and file the deed of ownership. About 1.5 million white families took advantage, and it excluded Black Americans in practice, but not in letter, right? There was nothing in the Homestead Act that if you just look at it, you would say, oh, well, that's going to be discriminatory. But it turns out, right, that if you're enslaved for the better part of your life, you don't know anything about how to navigate a bureaucracy. So you don't know how to figure out how to file an application. You probably don't have the resources to go west, much less squat on a plot of 160 acres of land for 5 years, making improvements. You don't know how to file for a deed of application, right? So the vast majority of Black Americans at the time, did not know how to navigate this system and did not view this as a program that was available to them. So the vast majority of 246 million acres of Western land went to white Americans. There was a Southern Homestead Act. I'm not sure if this was designed to sort of combat that a little bit, but it did grant land to about 28,000 individuals, some 4,000 to 5,000 of whom were emancipated slaves, right? And this is where the contracts that you're locked into sort of hampered your taking advantage of the program, because you're locked into a year-long contract and you couldn't break that in order to homestead, right? And it's also true, and I don't know, I haven't been able to find out the distribution of farmable versus unfarmable land. Right, I imagine, but I don't know, that the Black slaves who took advantage of the program were given land that was largely unfarmable or heavily wooded, and the white individuals who took advantage were probably given land that was more likely to bear wealth in a shorter period of time. So the effects on wealth of the Homestead Acts was about 10% of all the U.S. land that was given to white families in the 5 decades after the Civil War. Right, it's an enormous head start in terms of wealth development. 160 acres, almost anywhere, is going to be reasonably valuable. But there is estimated about 46 million current Americans who trace their lineage back to homesteaders. 46 million, and pretty much all of them are white. Right, so you can see how that might feed into the Black-white wealth gap that we have today. How else might laws not be expressly discriminatory, but overtly? Right. And these are laws, unlike the Homestead Act, as far as I know, the Homestead Act was not intended to be discriminatory, but there are lots of other laws on the books where they're intended to be discriminatory. But if you just look at it, it doesn't appear to be so. Right. And so how does that come about? Well, there were largely two provisions that were put in that allowed localities to discriminate. Right. And one is to allow local officials to administer the program. Right. You allow local officials to administer the program, even if it's a federal program, and then you don't provide any government oversight. Right. So here's a bunch of money and you divvy it up as you see fit. Right. So unemployment, lots of other programs. They could say, well, okay, you're white, you deserve higher unemployment payments than you because you're Black, even though maybe you worked the same job and you got laid off in the same place with the same set of wages. They could just simply hand out the money in a discriminatory way. The second is to exclude specific occupations where Black workers were overrepresented. Right. So in Social Security and minimum wages and in unemployment compensation, lots of occupations were excluded that ended up disproportionately excluding Black workers. So here are some of the policies with discriminatory effects. Right. The Homestead Act, not intended to be discriminatory, but was. The New Deal, the Wagner Act, and unions. The Wagner Act legalized unions. The problem with the Wagner Act was that it didn't include a provision that prevented unions from discriminating on union membership. Right, so it was largely white individuals who formed the unions, and they only let white individuals join the unions. Minimum wages, and that's an occupation issue. Social Security, another occupation issue. GI Bill, we'll talk about. We'll talk a little bit about federal asset building policies primarily next week. Local zoning ordinances, certainly discriminatory, and in fact, incarceration policy, we'll talk about that a little bit next week, and tax policy as well, we'll talk about next week. All right, well, let's go back to the New Deal. All right, so we talked about the FHA policy and redlining, and this was explicitly discriminatory. Social Security, unemployment, and minimum wages, they all omitted a wide variety of occupations, right? So people who were farm hands, they were excluded from Social Security, unemployment, and minimum wages. People who worked in restaurants, people who provided home care or home services, they were excluded from Social Security, unemployment, and minimum wages. And so in 1935, that made only 27% of white workers ineligible for Social Security, but it made 65% of Black workers ineligible security, right? And it was really the politicians from the South who were pushing for these exclusions, right? Trying to reintroduce or exacerbate differences in the treatment between Black and white individuals. And so if you look at just Blacks in the South, sure, overall in the United States, it was about 65% who were excluded. In the South, it was 70 to 80%. Right, so you foreclosed most of the Black workers in the South from this policy, which means that in the North, it was somewhere probably around 50 to 55%, about half of the Blacks that were excluded from these programs. Right. So let's talk a little bit more about the GI Bill. Again, I thought the GI Bill was a very important thing in U.S. policy history, and it was, but not only for the reasons that I thought. Right, Barry says, yes, farming was excluded, right? I mean, if you owned a farm, I left out an important category, right? So independent contractors also excluded from these policies, also excluded from Social Security, unemployment, and minimum wages, right? And that part of the law continues to today, right? I'm sure you guys live in California, so I'm sure that you are aware with the whole Uber, Lyft contractors versus employee thing, and how that's been going back and forth in the state. Well, that controversy was because of pro or anti-Black politicians in the 1930s, right? So lots of these policies, even though it looks like they've been taken care of largely through the civil rights era, they still exist and they still matter, right? As an economist, I've testified in several trucking cases down in Southern California, where the trucking company treats the employees like contractors so that they don't have to pay Social Security, they don't have to pay unemployment, they don't have to pay them minimum wages. Right? And that all goes back to slavery and the racist tendencies in the South of following the Civil War. So back to the GI Bill, there were about 16 million returning veterans. 1.2 million of them were Black. In terms of the loans, the GI Bill had loans for homes, farms, or businesses. But it turned out that developments like Levittown, I think in Pennsylvania, that were built sort of expressly to house veterans. They only agreed to build the houses if they could, put covenants in there that said, no Blacks allowed. Right, so Black GIs were explicitly banned from a lot of the new housing that was being built. In terms of education for the Black GIs, they were largely steered towards vocational training and not towards college. Those that did go to college, they couldn't go to Alabama State, they couldn't go to Oklahoma State, they couldn't go to Florida State, they couldn't go to the state colleges because the state colleges were for whites only. Right, so the Black GIs were directed to HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. Well, okay, so what's the problem there? Well, historically Black colleges and universities is still a college and university. The problem is that along with giving money to GIs to go to college, in particular white GIs, the state governments were giving a lot of money to the state schools to expand to accommodate the arrival of the white GIs, right? So there was growth in capacity where white GIs went, and there was no growth in capacity where Black GIs went, right? So they were overcrowded, and GIs that came back to the north, they were HBCUs did not exist. In terms of unemployment, there were huge differences in the amount of unemployment that local governments would give out under the GI Bill. And instead of being welcomed back as conquering heroes, the Black GIs were excluded from a lot that was in the GI Bill, and a lot of them were attacked if they were to wear their uniform down the street. It was even a bigger phenomenon after World War I, called the Red Summer, than it was after World War II. Right, so just huge inequities in terms of the welcome back. Some numbers for the GI Bill. Under the GI Bill, about $95 billion was spent, about 15% of the budget at the time. Went to finance 200,000 small business loans, mortgages from 5 million new houses, 2.25 million participated in higher education, and 5.5 million enrolled in vocational institutions. Right, but lots of this was on a biased basis. Let's look specifically at housing. Right, in 1947, two of 3,200 Veterans Administration loans in Mississippi went to Black veterans, just 2. In New York and Northern New Jersey, 100 of 67,000 loans went to Black veterans. So you can see, right, sure, there are more white veterans than there are Black, but there aren't 670 times more white veterans than there were Black. So enormous discrimination in handing out these loans. In terms of housing, right, tremendous potential for discrimination that prevented Black GIs from really making use of the GI Bill, right? So there's lots of disparate treatment. The Community Reinvestment Act, it obligates lenders to meet the needs of their entire service area. So if a service area had Black families in it, banks didn't go there. Lots of advertising and marketing geared towards white GIs, not towards Black. There were pre-screening mortgage applicants, screening out white from Black. And to the extent that Black GIs did get loans, they tended to get loans that had worse terms than did white GIs. Right? So the lending standards that were used were different for white and Black GIs. And the local zoning also, we talked about this, also designed to reflect the concentration of power in the hands of wealthier white residents. Nothing to do with the GI Bill anymore, right? So there was just generally less provided in the way of services to minority and low-income communities. All right, so it's at this point that I like to recommend a book called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. And she talks about how in the wake of, a big part of the small government movement that we have today has its origins in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And where on earth does that come from? Well, it turns out, right, with civil rights movement and the laws that were passed, let's take St. Louis. Right? Before the civil rights era, St. Louis built a world-class community pool. Huge pool with great amenities. And then the civil rights movement came, and because of laws passed during the civil rights movement, Black residents of St. Louis could no longer be excluded from that pool. And so the upshot of the civil rights laws was that they had to desegregate the pool. Well, what was the response of a lot of white citizens in St. Louis? Their response was, well, if we have to allow them in, then we don't want the pool. So literally, they paved over the pool instead of allowing it to segregate, right? And so this kind of put in a mindset, we don't want government programs if they are also going to benefit from them, right? So that's how a lot of the small government mentality of today got its roots. Its roots are in racial discrimination and the desire for racial segregation. Right, so lot size and setback requirements. Those serve to increase the cost of buying a single-family home. If your lot size, if your lot has to be bigger, that's going to be more expensive. If your court requires setbacks, if you want this a given size house, you're going to have to buy a bigger and bigger lot. Right? And then we talked about single-family residences and Berkeley. Okay, we can talk a little bit about anti-discrimination laws. Discrimination, Plessy versus Ferguson, if we go back to 1896, this was the ruling that sanctioned the Jim Crow laws that said separate but equal is just fine. We have no problem with segregated public facilities. They're legal so long as they're of equal quality. Right. Well, I think we all know that they probably weren't of equal quality. And that ruling persisted and was, governed the law of the land until Brown versus the Board of Education. Right? And Brown versus the Board of Education helped to establish the fact that separate but equal is not equal at all. The lower court ruled that the evidence suggests a detrimental effect on colored children, and it contributed to a sense of inferiority, but it did uphold the separate but equal doctrine. The Supreme Court came in and said separate but equal has no place because it is, again, inherently unequal. Now, the passage of Brown v. Board of Education was really important, but it was important more in intangible ways, right? It sort of kicked off the civil rights movement, right? People noticed, oh my gosh, we had some success there, so let's push harder. Let's push harder for civil rights. The tangible result of Brown, super hard to measure, right? You didn't see all of a sudden, lots of desegregation of schools. And the segregation of schools continues today, partly by the drawing of school district boundaries. Right. Not long ago, there was a community out in the East Bay that wanted to redraw the school district boundaries. What the white families wanted to do was redraw them so that it just had the wealthy parts of the school district and carve out the lower property value, lower income part of the district, right? So we still have school segregation going on, but it now takes a different form. You can't just say, sorry, no Black or Latino kids allowed, right? You redraw the school district so there aren't any Black or Latino kids in it. In Washington, D.C., within a mile of each other, there are schools where the difference in income and in quality of education is vastly different than schools just within a mile of each other. So we have not desegregated the schools. We have simply changed the way in which segregation of the schools comes about. Okay, so a little bit more on anti-discrimination legislation. I'm not an expert on this, so I'm not going to go into great detail. But in 1964, we had the Civil Rights Act, which ended Jim Crow and legal separation. Right, so it took 10 years from Brown v. Board of Education to legally get rid of segregation facilities. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act enforced the 15th Amendment, and it also established the criteria for Southern states to come to Congress to make sure that any voting laws that they passed were not discriminatory. Of course, we, 5 or 6 years ago decided that everything's just fine. That doesn't have to happen anymore. I think we're probably all well aware that the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 15th Amendment, does not guarantee equal access to the ballot box. Right? We also know that those who are determining access to the ballot box are probably largely white and probably largely high income. And actually, the efforts to reduce access to voting are being applied more to college students generally, right? College students are getting more liberal over time. And so they're trying to be excluded from the ability to vote. 1868 had the Fair Housing Act. It addressed lots of discrimination in real estate markets. It addressed it, but didn't solve the problem. As go back to our conversation about the Black couple in Marin City. All right, so what the civil rights movement and legislation did was it dismantled de jure or accepted or legal segregation and discrimination in labor markets, voting rights, healthcare, public accommodations, housing. Right, so enormously important. But again, lots of backlash. But what it did for a while was it brought about significant gains. Like Black male workers had significant gains in wages relative to white men until about 1980. Right? Now, if you go back to 2 weeks ago, the talk on economic inequality that I gave, right, 1980 was a turning point for a wide variety of different things. Right, inequality started to bloom, and the gains in Black wages relative to white men really stagnated. Well, the gains stopped in about 1980. So here's a look at progress. Right, if we go back to 1940, for employed Black men, their wages were about 40% of the wages of employed white men. Fast forward to 1980, and the wages of Black men were about 68%. Right, so that's more than a 50% reduction in the gap. Right, there's 68% of those white men. And it would have been really nice if this trajectory continued, but it's largely stagnated. In 2019, the wages, statistically different, I don't know, but the wages of Black men relative to white men appears to have dropped a little bit beyond what it was in 1980. And if we just look at all Black men, right, again, still a trajectory up to 1970, pretty stagnant and decline after 1970. So it works for a little while, but doesn't seem to have for the last 40 or more years. Let's turn to affirmative action a little bit. Affirmative action is the notion of giving preference and priority in education facilities, and employing workers, and in government contracting. Those are the three primary areas of affirmative action. Talk a little bit about the costs and benefits, right? With most policies, there are costs and there are benefits. And if the benefits outweigh the costs, then you pursue the policy. Well, in this case, just think about, in particular, education. Affirmative action in education that has the potential to lift Black and Latino students in terms of getting more of them to go to college in terms of their lifetime earnings. The costs, all right, and the cost one, and we hear a lot about this, white and now Asian students arguing that they're being discriminated against, right? The potential to displace other races and ethnicities in education, employment, and government contracts. Also, with regard in particular to government contracts, as well as employment, there's a potential to raise the cost of doing business, both in the private sector and in the public sector. Right, so those costs, if we're displacing, white and other ethnicities from college, that's a cost. If we're raising the cost of even just simply government contracting, that's the cost, and we have to figure out if doing the one is worth doing the others. How do we do that? Well, we turn to the evidence, and there's a little bit of evidence from here in California. In California, Proposition 209 was passed in 1996. That banned affirmative action in the state, banned affirmative action in government contracting, in education, and in employment practices, right? The benefit, a measured benefit of the ban of affirmative action was that the cost of government contracts fell by about 5.6%. What that means is that by handing out contracts on with affirmative action on a discriminatory basis, discriminating in favor of Black and Latino contractors, they ended up paying more for services, right? So a cost of about 5.6% in terms of government contracts. That was one of the benefit of getting rid of affirmative action, right? The costs in terms of getting rid of affirmative action, measurable impact on the educational quality for Black and Latino students, right? Not necessarily whether they went to college, but what the research found was that because of affirmative action, more Black and Latino students went to Tier 1 schools, right? Stanford's, more Black and Latino students went to tier 2 schools, the UC system. More Black and Latino students went to tier 3 schools, the Cal State system. More Black and Latinos went to community colleges. And then when you eliminate affirmative action, that pushes a bunch of the Black and Latino students who are in the tier 1 universities down into the tier 2, pushes a bunch who are in the tier 2 down into tier 3. So it lowers the quality of education, and certainly some fell out the bottom. Right, so it lowered the quality of education for Black and Latino students. In terms of white students, there was no measurable impact. Right, so affirmative action may have pushed Black and Latino students up into higher quality, but white students have a wider array of tier 1 quality universities to go to, right? So for a white student, that might have meant that instead of going to Cal, they went to Wisconsin. Instead of going to Cal, they went to Michigan. Instead of going to Stanford, they went to Harvard, right? So it moved around where the white students went, but it didn't diminish the quality of education the white students were getting. What the research has found, right, is that there was a discernible increase in lifetime earnings for Black and Latino students because of affirmative action. And in the wake of 2009, there's a measurable drop in Black and Latino employment in the state, right? So this is evidence, significant evidence, that affirmative action works. Right? But it comes at a cost. And what society has to do is figure out the balance between those costs and benefits. Is it worth the cost? In California, I think we just doubled down and banned affirmative action. So we've decided that no, it is not worth the cost. I fear that nationwide, I guess, I don't think it's going to happen this year, but I think next year the Supreme Court is likely to ban affirmative action nationwide. Which I personally find a little disappointing. Okay, just to summarize, this discrimination in U.S. policy has been coming through the post-slavery laws. There's lots of discrimination in some U.S. policies inherently, if not explicitly. A lot of policies because of structural differences, because of income differences, because of geographical differences. Policies that aren't necessarily discriminatory in a world that is completely equitable turn out to be discriminatory. All right, and the effect of more than 100 years of discrimination in policy is still readily measurable. We can see, if there was no effect of 100 years worth of discrimination, then affirmative action wouldn't matter. Right, but it does. Let's spend just a little bit of time talking about the economic consequences. These are going to be largely differences in outcomes for white versus Black individuals. An important outcome, in my view, is life expectancy. And what we find is that white men live on average about 3.5 years longer than do Black men. And white women live about 2.5 years longer than do white men. You can see, so the maroon line here, this is the trajectory of life expectancy for Black men. This is the era of the drug war, and now the era of deaths of despair impacting both of them. But there is a significant difference in life expectancy for Black versus white individuals. If we look at incomes, where do Black and white households fall in the distribution of income? This down here, this is the first quintile. So this is the share of white and Black populations that fall in the first quintile of income. That's the lowest income 20% of households. 18% of white households fall in that category. 33% of Black households are down in the low income range. If we look at the top fifth, right, 21% of white households are in the top 20%, the highest income 20% of households, and only 9% of Black households are. And so you can see there's a tremendous bias towards Black households being in the lower income part of the income distribution. We talked last week about mobility. Here's a graph that's a little bit different from what we talked about. But over on the left-hand side, for kids born into a household in the bottom quintile, born into a poor household, if you're white and you're born into a poor household, you have 26% chance that you'll be poor as an adult. If you're Black and you're born into a poor household, that chances are better than 50%, right? So half of Black kids born into a poor household are likely to be poor as an adult. Only a quarter of Black kids born into poor households are likely to be poor as an adult. If we go to the top end, right, 21%. So this is kids born into high-income households, and still the probability of being poor as an adult. So 1/5 of kids born into Black households that are in the top part of the income distribution will be poor, whereas it's only 10% of white kids, right? So there are enormous differences in economic mobility between Black and white kids. And here is a spoiler alert for next week. This is the wealth gap, right? Over here on the left-hand side, this is differences in average wealth. So in 2019, the average wealth of a white household was about $1 million. The average wealth in a Black household, $142.5 thousand. So average in white households is 7 times greater than in Black. A lot of people don't look at the average, prefer to look at the median, right? Because if Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Warren Buffett are Black versus white, that's going to change these numbers significantly, but it's not going to change the median at all. Right, but what we find is that the gap is comparable. Median, right? The median income, that's wealth, that's the wealth of the household in the middle of the distribution. If we line up all the households from low wealth to high wealth, median is the household right in the middle. And so for white families, half of white families have wealth less than 188,000. Half of Black families have wealth less than 24,000. Fully 1/3 of Black households have no wealth at all, or negative wealth. Right. And it makes a difference. There are differences in labor force participation rates. So those are over here on the left, it's white men not working. The orange is because they're institutionalized, mostly in prison. Green is out of the labor force, and brown or gray is unemployed. The bars are much higher. It's for the same time period for Black men not working as for white, and the bars are much larger for Black men rather than white. Also matters for things like maternal mortality rates, right? Maternal mortality rates for white women, 14.7 deaths per 100,000 live births. For Black women, the number is about 2.5 times higher, 37.1 deaths per 100,000 live births. For Hispanic women, the number is significantly lower. I don't know why that is, but for our purposes, there's this massive difference that's important for our conversation. It also turns out that discrimination has huge implications for GDP. In 1960, 90% of doctors were white men. In 2010, just 60% of doctors were white men, right? And that transformation applies to a large variety of different occupations. Right, so that means that occupations are opening up, right? They're not just white men anymore, right? Why? The exclusion from high-skilled occupations of women and minorities because of lack of access to appropriate schooling and more broadly speaking, the human capital development, right? Or so societal-based preference, right? It could be that in 1960, no patients wanted to go see, no white patients wanted to go see women doctors or Black doctors, right? This kind of discrepancy still plays a significant role. I have a good friend who is the president of a wealth management company, and I asked her how many of their wealth managers are Black. She said exactly none, right? Because those with wealth tend to be white men, and they much prefer to deal with white men and have white men manage their finances than a Black man or a woman. They do have women as advisors, but not proportional to population, right? So there are societal-based preferences, and those preferences were shifting a lot between 1960 and 2010. The upshot is that this change in access to high-skilled work explains about 40%, that's almost half of all of the GDP growth between 1960 and 2010. So GDP growth would have been much slower had we not had more integration in high-skilled occupations. So discrimination matters. Discrimination has big implications for the economy as a whole. It has big implications, right, because it causes us to have smaller government. I encourage you to read a book called Jumpstarting America that talks about how when we had bigger government in the 1950s and 60s, we had much faster growth and why that is. Jumpstarting America, a really good book. Okay, so what about policy solutions? We could sit here literally all day and talk about policy solutions. There are so many different areas in which we could bring about change. We could bring about reduction in discrepancies, asset accumulation. We'll talk about that next week. Education, housing, healthcare, incarceration, again next week. Transportation systems, broadband, hiring policies. There are so many different policy areas where we could jump in, make change, and make a difference. And again, just a reminder that next week is the Black and White Wealth Gap. We will talk about a variety of explanations for these gaps and why most of them don't hold water. And I think that conversation will be much more compelling in light of the conversation that we've just had today. All right, Linda, I see your question. I'll get to that in just a second. But here again is how to contact me. I will send Lois a link to these slides, which will be up on NEED's website. And I want to there are a bunch of sort of bonus slides in here that I wasn't going to have time for. So I encourage you to go to NEED's website and download the slides and have a look. So for now, I'll stop sharing. I will take care of Linda's question. Do you know if any of the information you presented today is part of any high school or college econ, history, or government classes? This info does not seem to be available to young people who have more opportunity to change policy in the future. Well, Linda, so interesting that you should ask. I gave this talk to an Ollie in Florida, and somebody early on in my talk put in the chat, is this talk legal? And I had never contemplated whether or not it would be legal, but in Florida, it was an open question. And I think that goes some ways towards answering your question, that there are more and more states in which young kids, the students, have less and less access to this kind of information. I mean, I would love to take this information into every high school in America, but certainly in Florida, that probably wouldn't be acceptable. So I don't think so. I just don't think so. I'm guessing that it's probably a lot of it is new information for a lot of you. And that's part of why NEED exists, to get all this information that I think is really important out into the public. David asks, how much of income and wealth inequality in the USA is explainable by differences between races? You're asking me to tread on my talk for next week. The answer is we don't really know, but it's significant. So we'll talk more about that next week. Cher puts in, I recently heard a theorist refer to private equity and REITs as a new form of redlining because these vehicles frequently buy up inexpensive properties in urban low-income neighborhoods. It occurs to me that these would be many of the same neighborhoods affected by past explicit redlining. Does this claim about PE and REITs seem to be the case? And if so, what is the likely trajectory of these activities? So Cher, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Honestly, it would surprise me if you're not right. Because what that's going to do, they're going to buy up low cost neighborhoods and they're going to turn them into high cost neighborhoods, right, which pushes the occupants of those neighborhoods elsewhere. So probably. I have a relatively dim view of PE and REITs, but that's probably a topic for another day. Tim asks, could I post in the chat the URL to download the slides? I don't have your email or the link to the slides. So Tim, I can put in, let's see, let me go get it. I don't have a link for these slides because they're not up yet, but I have a link for the page where you can find these slides. And let me put that in the chat. You can find these slides and the slides for literally every other talk that somebody has given for NEED. Okay, so there's the URL. And books that I recommend, The Sum of Us and Jumpstarting America. There are a ton of other books that I could recommend, but I think those two are really pretty important. Let's see. I lost my Zoom window. Okay, there it is. All right. Anybody else have any more comments, thoughts, or questions?
Well, I'll ask one. I guess the thing I was most kind of surprised at was new to me it was the issue about redlining and such. I mean, I certainly have heard of this, but I always thought this was the banks that did it. But this was explicitly in the federal government guidelines. You showed these slides with HOLC. What does that stand for?
That's the Homeowners Loan Corporation.
Okay.
That was it was a federal government sponsored private organization.
Okay. Yeah, but the idea that was, well, I mean, at the time, was there some pushback? I mean, were there any liberals in 1930? Communists.
I'm pretty sure that there was. They just weren't in government at the time very much.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I found that to be enormously distressing. Ultimately at the end of the day, right? So that slide deck is a journey that I embarked on relatively recently. So, if you go back 10 years, most of that I didn't know about either. Because it doesn't get taught. Right? We have whitewashed our history books.
But wasn't there an argument between FDR and Eleanor about the racist sides of the New Deal?
Oh, I'm absolutely, yes, there was.
About Social Security and things.
Yeah, and Roosevelt wasn't in favor of excluding those occupations. He wasn't in favor of the discriminatory aspects. He didn't want that either. But at the end of the day, he had to make a decision.
Right.
Do we do nothing, or do we do this and have it be discriminatory? I'm pretty sure he made the right decision. But at the end of the day, you don't know what path we would have gone down had he made another one.
Okay. Well, let me ask. Lois had a question.
Well, if you were giving the same talk about Latino families, not going that far back, but would it be pretty much the same, do you think?
That's a really good question. I guess my guess is that yes, it would be pretty much the same. And you could certainly do the same with Asian Americans, right? The whole slavery thing isn't nearly as explicit, more of an indentured servitude role. But the racism experienced by Latinos and Asians throughout U.S. history has been enormous. And California's record on this is pretty atrocious. Pretty atrocious. So I haven't done the research, but I strongly suspect that there is a very similar narrative, right? And everything having to do with single family versus multifamily, that's addressing all different forms of discrimination, including economic, right? It excluded Latino and Asian families as well. Asian families were also more likely to be low income. So a lot of the laws that I talked about apply not only to Black Americans, but to Black and Brown Americans.
Okay, well, and I have one more. Nobody else. So early on, you talked about the 1619 project, and I've read that part of the conclusion of that is they made a strong argument that slavery was a huge factor, maybe the major factor in the fundamental development of capitalism in the United States. And I know it's been very controversial, but have you followed that argument at all?
Yeah, I have. Not as closely as I would like to. But yeah, there's a pretty good argument that the United States would not be the country that it is today had we not had slavery. Our economic development, the growth in per capita white incomes was much, much faster with slavery than it ever would have been without. Right. So, we would have had a cotton industry, but cotton would have been much more expensive. There would have been much less of it. That would have lowered incomes in white America in the South. There would have been less cotton flowing through the North. That would have lowered the incomes. That would have lowered our exports. You can make a very, very good case. Not with complete certainty, but you can make a very good case that the pace of economic development in the United States was hastened significantly by slavery. And people who try to make the case for reparations will use that as a basis, right? You know, our ancestors were the backs upon which this country was built, and look how you've treated us in the century since, in the century and a half since. We'll talk a little bit more about reparations next week.
I was going to ask that. Yeah.
Doesn't have to be income.
Mhm.
Aggressive affirmative action can be another form of reparation,
Mhm.
but we're not going to do that.
Mhm.
Here's a trivia question. Where was the first person to illegally cross the southern border? Where did that person come from? Anybody want to hazard a guess?
Mhm.
China.
China. Oh, okay.
Ah.
So that was how that particular illegal path into the United States started,
Mhm.
in the wake of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
So Tim says the ethos of meritocracy is presumed to increase productivity and efficiency. Affirmative action is claimed to undermine meritocracy. Is there any evidence for this position? You know, I don't think that we really have a meritocracy in the United States, right? We used to like to make the case that we had much more of a meritocracy in the United States than we did in Europe because they've got aristocracies, right? But yeah, if you go to well-heeled private schools, high schools, they're pretty much all white,
Mhm.
right? And that doesn't mean that the kids who are there are the best and brightest. It means that their parents did really well. If you look at you know, the propensity for smart kids to make it out of the ghetto, it's pretty low, right? There are enormous impediments to people who could, you know, people with lots and lots of potential. There are enormous impediments in the United States for them to make it as if we were a meritocratic society. I think that affirmative action, I don't know this, I think affirmative action has the potential to, you know, to grease the wheels of our meritocracy, right? You know, there are a lot of really, really smart kids in low-income neighborhoods, in minority neighborhoods, a ton of really smart kids who can't get out. And a lot of them don't survive to adulthood. In those neighborhoods, gunfire is, I think, the leading cause of death amongst teenagers, and certainly teenage boys, right? They don't make it out. If we truly had a meritocratic system, they could make it out. And affirmative action helps them make it out. There's a strong case to be made that affirmative action doesn't go far enough, right? It helps them get into college, but then it sort of tosses them in to Harvard or Stanford or wherever and says, you know, good luck to you. So I think that there are a lot of policies out there that we could implement that would grease the skids of our meritocracy, that could remove some of the cogs, some of the spanners in the works of our meritocracy, if you will. Does mental health rates follow income? I don't know. I don't know.
It must, because of the stresses involved
Yeah,
in day-to-day life for Blacks.
I would imagine so. You know, and this is another opening. I mean, the history of stress. There's lots of evidence that, you know, if your grandparents were subject to a lot of stress, your parents, there's a change in the genetic makeup that causes, I believe I'm going to get this right, but I'm not sure, but that exacerbates any stress that they have in their life. They experience it with more difficulty, and it's a bigger impediment to success. If your parents, right, there are studies that show that if your parents grew up in poverty, that has implications for you, even if you did not grow up in poverty. So I would strongly suspect that yes, mental health does follow income, although
They probably don't get to mental health services. So
well, that was part of my hesitation.
Yeah.
You know,
Nobody does.
documented instances of mental health issues, probably much more likely to be documented if you're high income. So I don't know what the statistics would suggest, but I strongly suspect that, yeah. I mean, there's just enormous stress that can that can weigh on your mental health if you are low income.
Or if you're a minority, it's
Yes, thank you.
discriminated against in every way by the police and everything else.
Yes, absolutely right.
Come in,
Oh,
come in.
somebody's calling. So, John, just wanted to kind of off topic a bit, but in that one of the last slides, you showed that the median household wealth was, you know, for white people or something, was about $188,000. So that brings up the issue of whether people have enough money to retire, which I know is a huge issue. I don't know if you've talked about that in any of your classes.
I haven't.
Yeah.
You know, I had a delegate who was at one point was working on a slide deck entitled "The Risk and Rewards of Retirement," where that would be certainly part of the topic. That 188,000, that's, you know, in terms of having enough retirement savings, that's going to be really misleading because that includes households in their 20s, right? If you look at, right, so the median for households, you know, age 55 to 65 is going to be much higher. But for sure, there's a huge chunk of households that are not saving enough.
You know, there was one more thing. I think that the way college students these days finish up with a huge amount of debt, I think that probably exacerbates the problem, even for the ones who get discriminatory, you know, admittance.
Yeah.
Because they can't get high-paying jobs, or their income when they are employed will be lower.
Yeah, no, it
Good
might
point.
well exacerbate that. You know, overall, as an economist, I look at the returns to education, and it's pretty easy to say that it's still worth the investment if you even if you come out with all of those loans. But if you look at it on, you look at the inequities that might result, you know, much like the library card inequities, you know, it may well be. That's a really good point. I'm gonna have to think about that, see if I can find some data on it. It's certainly been indicated that a forgiveness of student loan debt will be, you know, a policy that will help with that black-white wealth gap.
Yeah.
And also income inequality.
Yeah.
In general.
Okay, well, it's about 11:38, and I do have to go. So thanks everybody for coming, and I'll look forward to continuing basically this conversation next week, where we'll look really deeply at the black-white wealth gap.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Great. Take care, everybody. See you next week.
You too. Be safe.
Bye-bye.